Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. Tonight, we are looking at one of the most famous questions in all of history, and also one of the most misunderstood. How were the pyramids actually built? Why do so many modern explanations feel either too simple or too theatrical? And why does the truth, when we slow down and examine it carefully, turn out to be more impressive than the myth? This is not just a story about heavy stones in a desert. It is a story about planning, labor, landscape, time, and the unusual power of a state that could organize thousands of lives around a single vision. And perhaps most interesting of all, the answer is probably not one dramatic secret, but a chain of practical solutions that made something almost impossible gradually become real. Before we settle in, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful long-form history, consider subscribing. This channel is built for viewers who like serious stories told with patience, context, and care. And if you'd like to support that kind of documentary work, a quiet like on the video really does help. I always enjoy hearing where people are watching from as well, so feel free to leave a comment with your country, what time it is where you are, and what history topic you would like us to explore next. When people picture the pyramids being built, they often imagine one of two things. Either they imagine a vast army of enslaved people dragged into brutal labor under the whip, or they imagine some lost technology, some vanished machine, or some hidden trick too advanced for the ancient world. But neither of those explanations is especially satisfying. The first is too blunt, and the second usually appears when we underestimate what organized human beings can achieve with enough time, discipline, and administrative skill. The real story is quieter than that, but also more revealing. The pyramids were not built in a burst of mystery. They were built through a system. To understand that system, we have to begin with the world of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, especially the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, around the 26th century BC. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid rose at Giza, Egyptian builders were not beginners. The pyramid did not appear out of nowhere. It stood at the end of a long architectural learning process. Earlier rulers had been buried in mastabas, low rectangular tombs. Then came Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, a bold transformation of the royal tomb into something layered and monumental. Later, under Sneferu, experiments became even more ambitious. One pyramid at Mihdam was altered. The bent pyramid at Dahshur changed angle mid-construction, perhaps because the original design created structural concerns. The Red Pyramid followed, more stable and more successful. In other words, by the time Khufu's builders began work at Giza, Egyptian architects had already spent decades learning through trial, revision, and failure. That matters because it changes the question. The Great Pyramid was not a miracle that appeared in ignorance. It was the product of accumulated experience. The men responsible for it inherited methods, measurements, quarrying skills, transport techniques, and above all a confidence that stone on this scale could be made to obey an idea. The real achievement was not simply lifting blocks. It was coordinating an enormous project with remarkable consistency over many years. The first step was choosing the site. Giza was not selected at random. It offered a rocky plateau strong enough to support immense weight. It stood close enough to the Nile for transport, but high enough to create a commanding presence above the floodplain. The builders could anchor the monument in bedrock, and they could also connect the site to the river through canals and basins during the inundation season, when the Nile rose and transport by boat became easier. This is one of the first important corrections to the popular image. The pyramids were not built in total isolation from supply routes. They were tied into the river system, which functioned as the great transport highway of ancient Egypt. Then there was the stone itself. Much of the core limestone for the Great Pyramid came from the Giza Plateau, cut locally from quarries near the monument. That alone reduced one part of the problem. Not every block had to travel across Egypt. Some finer white casing stones, which once made the pyramid gleam in the sun, came from Tura across the Nile. Granite for the internal chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. So the project involved different categories of material, each requiring different levels of effort and care. Once we see that, the picture becomes more realistic. The monument was not made from one uniform stream of identical stones. It was an organized flow of resources, with local material for bulk construction and select imported stone for key structural and visual elements. How were these stones moved? Here again, the likely answer is practical rather than magical. Quarry workers cut blocks using stone tools, copper implements, wooden levers, and pounding techniques suited to the material. Once detached, blocks could be loaded onto wooden sledges. A famous tomb seen from a later period shows a colossal statue being hauled on a sledge while a worker pours liquid in front of it. That detail has attracted serious attention because dampening sand can reduce friction and make heavy loads easier to drag. It is a small detail, but it points toward a larger truth. Ancient construction often depended on modest improvements repeated thousands of times. The builders did not need to eliminate difficulty. They only needed to manage it. And then we arrive at the question everyone asks. What about ramps? For generations, the simple image was a giant straight ramp leading up the side of the pyramid. That may sound sensible at first, but it creates problems of its own. A ramp long and shallow enough to haul heavy blocks to great height would require enormous quantities of material, perhaps so much that the ramp itself would become a project nearly as large as the pyramid. Because of that, many scholars now think the answer was probably more varied. Lower levels may have used broad straight ramps or combinations of straight and zigzagging ramps. Higher levels may have involved angled side ramps, wrapping ramps, internal access routes, lever systems, or shifting construction methods as the structure rose. That is why the phrase "not what you think" fits so well here. The real answer may not be one ramp, but several strategies changing over time as the geometry of the problem changed. This is where the story becomes even more interesting, because the pyramid was not only an engineering challenge. It was an administrative challenge on a national scale. Workers had to be fed, housed, rotated, supervised, and organized into teams. We know from archaeological discoveries near Giza that there were labor settlements, bakeries, breweries, storage facilities, and evidence of planned provisioning. Graffiti left by work gangs suggests named crews with identities and pride in their role. That pushes us further away from the old image of endless anonymous slaves. The labor force almost certainly included skilled workers, seasonal laborers, specialists, overseers, haulers, masons, surveyors, boatmen, cooks, and many others. Some labor may have been compulsory as a form of state service, but that is not the same thing as the popular cinematic image of mass chattel slavery. In fact, one of the deeper historical twists is that pyramid building may reveal not just royal power, but the capacity of the Egyptian state to mobilize labor through taxation, duty, ideology, and reward. That ideological part is easy to overlook from a modern distance. To us, a pyramid is a monument. To ancient Egypt, it was also bound to kingship, cosmic order, and the maintenance of the world. The king was not merely a political ruler. He stood at the center of religion, legitimacy, and divine balance. Building his tomb was therefore not an eccentric vanity project in the modern sense. It was tied to how the state imagined continuity, order, and sacred power. That does not make the work easy, and it does not make the burden light, but it does explain why such massive effort could appear reasonable within that society. Sometimes the hardest thing for modern viewers to imagine is not the engineering, but the belief system that made the engineering worth doing. Even the accuracy of the Great Pyramid deserves a quieter kind of admiration. Its orientation is astonishingly precise. Its base was carefully leveled. Its internal spaces were planned with a sophistication that still invites debate. None of this suggests chaos. It suggests measurement, observation, and disciplined procedure. Ancient Egyptian surveyors did not need modern lasers to produce accuracy. They needed reliable methods, trained eyes, repeated checking, and a culture of workmanship that took exactness seriously. Once again, the secret is less glamorous than myth, but far more convincing. There is also another misconception worth setting aside. People often imagine the pyramid as a completed object from the moment the last block was laid. But for the builders, it would have been a changing construction zone for years. Quarries opened and deepened. Transport channels had to function. Stones arrived in sequences. Outer casing was shaped and fitted. Internal passages had to be protected. Different sections were at different stages at the same time. The pyramid was a process long before it was a landmark. And that process depended on rhythm. The Nile flood season likely played a major role in labor availability and transport logistics, linking the monument to the agricultural calendar of Egypt itself. By this point, the mystery begins to change shape. The question is no longer how could ancient people possibly do this. The better question is what kind of society could sustain the attention, food supply, labor control, technical knowledge, and ideological commitment needed to keep doing it day after day, season after season. That is the deeper answer hidden behind the stones. The Great Pyramid was not simply built by strength. It was built by administration, by repetition, by planning, by a state whose power could be measured not just in armies or wealth, but in its ability to turn quarry cuts, boat journeys, sled tracks, bread rations, and human routines into one coherent structure. And yet, for all that, some uncertainty remains. Historians and archaeologists still debate details of the exact methods, especially at the upper levels. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes the subject worth returning to. We know a great deal, enough to reject fantasy and oversimplification, but we do not know every operational step. The result is a picture that feels properly historical. Grounded, evidence-based, impressive, and still open at the edges. So when we look at the pyramids now, perhaps the most surprising conclusion is that they do not become less marvelous once the myths fall away. They become more human, more laborious, more organized, more dependent on foresight and patience. Not the work of sorcery, and not the product of a single dramatic trick, but the achievement of thousands of people operating inside a system powerful enough to shape stone, time, and belief into a single monument that still dominates the horizon. And that may be the lasting power of the pyramids. They remind us that history is often most astonishing when it is most concrete. A wet path laid before a sledge. A quarry cut measured carefully. A team hauling in rhythm. A planner thinking years ahead. A ruler turning theology into architecture. If you had lived in that world, do you think the pyramid would have felt like a source of pride, a burden, or perhaps both at once? And what part of its construction is hardest for you to imagine? The physical effort, the organization behind it, or the belief that made it necessary? Let me know in the comments, along with where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. There is another layer to this story that is easy to overlook if we focus only on the physical act of building. The pyramid was not simply assembled upward in a straightforward progression. It was designed in advance with a level of planning that required foresight long before the first stone was placed. Surveyors had to mark out the base with remarkable precision. This likely involved careful observation of the stars, especially circumpolar stars, to establish true north. That detail alone tells us something important. The builders were not improvising. They were working from a conceptual blueprint, even if it was not drawn in the modern sense. Once the base was established, leveling the ground became a critical step. The Giza Plateau is not perfectly flat, and yet the foundation of the Great Pyramid is astonishingly even. Some researchers believe that the builders may have used water-filled trenches or channels to help identify a consistent level, allowing them to cut the bedrock accordingly. It is a subtle solution, but one that fits the broader pattern we keep seeing. Instead of relying on advanced machinery, they relied on repeatable, observable principles. Gravity, water, and alignment became tools in their own right. As the structure began to rise, coordination became more important than raw strength. Thousands of workers could not simply move independently. They had to work in sequence. Quarry teams extracted stone. Transport teams moved it. Placement teams set it into position. Supervisors ensured consistency. And above them all, administrators kept track of supply, timing, and labor rotation. It is here that the pyramid begins to resemble something more familiar to us, not in appearance, but in structure. In some ways, it functioned like a carefully managed project on a national scale, with different departments contributing to a single outcome. One of the more revealing discoveries in recent years comes from papyri found at Wadi el-Jarf, which describe the activities of a man named Mirror, an official involved in transporting limestone blocks. His records suggest that stone was moved by boat along the Nile and through a system of canals closer to the construction site. This adds another piece to the puzzle. The pyramid was not isolated from infrastructure. It was connected to a wider network of movement and supply. When we imagine the building process, we should picture not just workers at Giza, but boats traveling, records being kept, and schedules being followed. And yet, even with all this organization, the task remained immense. Each block had to be fitted with care. While the interior stones might appear rough, the outer casing stones were shaped with remarkable precision, forming smooth surfaces that reflected sunlight. When the pyramid was newly completed, it would have looked very different from what we see today. Instead of a stepped or weathered surface, it would have appeared almost polished, its sides gleaming under the Egyptian sun. That visual effect was not accidental. It reinforced the symbolic power of the structure, connecting it to light, permanence, and the divine. At this point, it becomes useful to pause and reconsider a common assumption. We often think of ancient people as limited by their technology, and in many ways they were. But they were not limited in their ability to organize time and labor. In fact, one could argue that this was their greatest strength. Without machines to accelerate the process, they compensated with patience. Without modern tools, they compensated with coordination. The pyramid was not built quickly. It was built steadily, and that steady progress is part of what made it possible. There is also the question of how long it took. Estimates vary, but many historians suggest that the Great Pyramid could have been completed within about 20 years, roughly the length of Khufu's reign. At first, that might sound unlikely, given the scale of the project. But when we break it down, the numbers become more manageable. If thousands of workers were involved, and if multiple teams worked simultaneously on different sections, the daily output required becomes less overwhelming. Again, the key is not speed, but consistency. Another detail that often goes unnoticed is the role of skill. Not all workers were performing the same tasks. Some were highly trained craftsmen, responsible for shaping and placing stones with precision. Others were general laborers, contributing to transport and support work. This division of labor allowed the project to function efficiently. It also suggests that knowledge was being passed down, refined, and applied across generations of builders. The pyramid was not just a monument. It was also the result of a skilled workforce operating within a structured system. As the pyramid reached its upper levels, the challenge changed. Moving stones higher required different techniques than moving them at ground level. This is where the idea of multiple ramp systems becomes especially important. Rather than relying on a single massive ramp, the builders may have adapted their approach as the structure rose, using smaller, more manageable ramps or even internal pathways. This flexibility would have reduced the need for excessive materials and allowed the construction to continue without becoming impractical. And yet, despite all these explanations, there remains a quiet sense of wonder. Not because the methods are mysterious, but because they are so grounded. The more we understand, the more we see that the pyramid was not built by a single breakthrough, but by a series of decisions, each one practical, each one contributing to the whole. It is a reminder that extraordinary results often come from ordinary processes applied with discipline and scale. It is also worth reflecting on what the pyramid meant to the people who built it. For the workers, it was likely a mixture of duty, livelihood, and identity. It was a statement of power and continuity. And for the king, it was a preparation for the afterlife, a structure meant to endure beyond a single lifetime. These different perspectives remind us that history is rarely simple. The same structure can carry multiple meanings at once, depending on where you stand. As we move further into this story, one question begins to take shape. If the pyramids were built through organization, belief, and practical methods, what does that tell us about the limits of human achievement in other times and places? And perhaps more quietly, what assumptions do we still carry today that might one day seem just as incomplete as the old myths about the pyramids? We will continue to explore that idea as we look deeper into the final stages of construction, the legacy of the pyramid, and how its meaning has changed over thousands of years. As the upper sections of the pyramid began to take shape, the nature of the work became more delicate, more precise, and in some ways more revealing of the builder's true capabilities. It is one thing to move heavy stone across flat ground. It is another to align those stones as the structure narrows, where even small deviations become more noticeable. The geometry of the pyramid demanded consistency. Each layer had to be slightly smaller than the one below, and the angles had to remain stable over time. This was not simply stacking. It was controlled reduction, guided by measurement and experience. One of the quieter achievements of the Great Pyramid is how well that consistency was maintained. The sides rise at an angle of about 51 degrees, and that angle is preserved with impressive accuracy. This suggests that the builders were not only following a design, but also continuously checking their work. Simple tools like plumb lines, leveling instruments, and measuring cords would have been used repeatedly. These are not advanced technologies in a modern sense, but when applied with discipline, they can produce remarkably precise results. At this stage, we can begin to see the pyramid not just as a construction site, but as a system of feedback. Each layer informed the next. Each measurement corrected the previous one. Over time, small adjustments accumulated into large-scale accuracy. This is another subtle but important shift in how we understand the project. It was not perfect from the start. It became precise through repetition. There is also a human rhythm to this process that is easy to miss. The work would have followed cycles influenced by the Nile's flooding, agricultural demands, and administrative planning. During the inundation season, when farming was temporarily paused, more labor could be directed toward construction. This seasonal pattern allowed the state to mobilize workers without permanently removing them from their communities. It was, in a sense, a balance between necessity and opportunity. The pyramid did not exist outside daily life. It was woven into it, and as the structure rose higher, visibility changed as well. The monument would have become more imposing, not just to distant observers, but to the workers themselves. Each new layer would have altered the skyline, gradually transforming the plateau into something unmistakable. It is worth pausing here for a moment. Imagine working on such a project not for days or weeks, but for years, watching it grow, knowing that your effort contributed to something that would likely outlast you. That awareness alone may have shaped how the work was perceived, turning it from a task into a shared experience. At the same time, the internal structure of the pyramid was being completed. Passageways, chambers, and relieving spaces had to be carefully integrated into the mass of stone. The king's chamber, constructed from granite, required particularly careful handling. Granite is harder and more difficult to work than limestone, and transporting it from Aswan added another layer of complexity. Yet it was chosen deliberately, perhaps for its strength and symbolic value. Above the chamber, a series of relieving chambers were constructed to distribute weight and prevent collapse. This is another example of foresight. The builders were not only concerned with creating a monumental shape, but with ensuring its stability over time. This brings us to an important realization. The pyramid was designed to last, not just for decades, but for generations. That intention influenced every decision, from the choice of materials to the precision of construction. It also reflects something deeper about the society that built it. A willingness to invest in permanence, to create something that extended beyond immediate needs, suggests a particular relationship with time. The pyramid was not built for the present. It was built for continuity. As the final layers were placed, the outer casing stones would have been fitted with care, creating the smooth surface that defined the pyramid's appearance. These stones were polished and aligned so precisely that the joints between them were barely visible. Over time, many of these casing stones were removed or lost, but their original effect can still be imagined. The pyramid would have stood not as a rough stack of blocks, but as a clean, geometric form, reflecting light and dominating the landscape. And then, at some point, the work stopped. Not suddenly, but gradually as the final tasks were completed. The ramps, whatever form they took, would have been dismantled. The site would have been cleared, leaving the pyramid standing on its own. What had been a place of activity became a place of stillness. The transformation from construction site to monument is easy to overlook, but it marks a significant shift. The pyramid was no longer something being built. It was something that existed. From that moment onward, its meaning began to evolve. For the Egyptians, it remained tied to kingship and the afterlife. For later observers, it became a symbol of ancient power, then a subject of curiosity, and eventually a global icon. Each generation has interpreted it differently, sometimes projecting its own assumptions onto it. This is where many of the myths we mentioned earlier begin to take shape. When a structure survives for thousands of years, it invites explanation. And when the original context fades, imagination often fills the gaps. But if we return to what we know, the picture remains grounded. The pyramids were built by people who understood their environment, who developed techniques over time, and who operated within a system capable of sustaining large-scale projects. There is no need to diminish their achievement by attributing it to mystery. In fact, the opposite is true. The more we understand their methods, the more impressive their work becomes. There is also something quietly instructive in this story. It reminds us that complexity does not always require complexity in tools. Sometimes it requires clarity in process. The pyramid was not the result of a single invention, but of many small decisions aligned toward a single goal. That alignment is what made the difference, and perhaps that is where the deeper reflection begins. When we look at the pyramid today, we are not just looking at stone. We are looking at coordination, belief, and time made visible. We are looking at what a society chose to prioritize and how it chose to organize itself around that priority. It raises a question that extends beyond ancient Egypt. What do our own structures say about us, and how will they be understood in the future? As we bring this part of the story to a close, there is a quiet contrast worth considering. The pyramid feels permanent, unchanging, almost outside of time, but its creation was anything but static. It was dynamic, evolving, and deeply human. That contrast is part of what makes it so compelling. A monument that appears still, built through movement. A structure that feels timeless, created through years of effort. If you've stayed with me this far, you might find yourself seeing the pyramids a little differently now. Not as isolated wonders, but as the outcome of a system that balanced practicality and belief. And I'm curious which part of that system stands out to you the most. Is it the organization, the engineering, or the human effort behind it? And do you think we sometimes underestimate what ancient societies were capable of achieving with the resources they had? Let me know your thoughts, and as always, feel free to share where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what history you'd like us to explore next. If we step back for a moment, away from the physical structure itself, another question begins to emerge. One that is less about how the pyramids were built and more about why this particular form was chosen at all. After all, the pyramid is not the only way to create a large, enduring monument. It is, however, one of the most stable shapes possible. As the structure rises, its weight is distributed downward and outward in a way that naturally resists collapse. In that sense, the pyramid is not only symbolic, it is structurally logical. But even that explanation only takes us part of the way. For the ancient Egyptians, shape and meaning were closely connected. The pyramid is often associated with the idea of the Benben, a primordial mound that, according to Egyptian belief, emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. It was a place of first light, of origin, of emergence. The pyramid, rising sharply toward the sky, may have been intended to echo that concept, linking the king's tomb to the very beginnings of the world. It also aligned with solar symbolism. The smooth sides, once covered in white casing stone, would have reflected sunlight in a way that connected the monument to the sun god Ra. In this way, the pyramid was not just a tomb. It was a statement about creation, order, and cosmic continuity. This adds another layer to our understanding. The pyramid was not simply built because it could be built. It was built because it fit within a broader system of meaning. The engineering and the belief were not separate. They supported each other. The more stable the structure, the more convincing the symbolism. And the more powerful the symbolism, the more justified the effort required to construct it. Over time, however, this style of monumental building began to change. Later Egyptian rulers did not continue building pyramids on the same scale. Instead, they shifted toward hidden tombs in places like the Valley of the Kings. This transition is sometimes explained in terms of security. Pyramids, for all their grandeur, were highly visible targets for tomb robbers. Hidden tombs offered greater protection. But there is also a broader shift in how royal burial was approached, suggesting changes in political structure, religious emphasis, and available resources. This change itself is a kind of quiet revelation. It reminds us that the pyramid was not an inevitable outcome of Egyptian civilization. It was a choice made within a specific period under specific conditions. When those conditions changed, so did the architecture. That alone challenges the idea that the pyramids were somehow beyond the normal flow of history. They were part of it, shaped by it, and eventually replaced by other forms. And yet, despite that shift, the pyramids endured. They remained on the landscape long after their original purpose had faded. Later civilizations encountered them with a mixture of curiosity and misunderstanding. The Greeks, who visited Egypt thousands of years after the pyramids were built, tried to make sense of them within their own frameworks. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded stories about their construction that mixed observation with hearsay. Some of his accounts suggest large labor forces and long periods of work, but they also reflect the limits of knowledge at the time. Even then, the pyramids were already ancient, already partially obscured by time. This pattern continues into the modern era. As knowledge of ancient Egypt expanded, so did the effort to understand how the pyramids were built. Archaeology, engineering analysis, and experimental reconstruction have all contributed to a more grounded picture. Researchers have recreated stone-moving techniques, tested ramp theories, and studied tool marks in quarries. Each of these efforts brings us closer to the practical realities behind the monument. And yet, the fascination remains. Perhaps because the pyramids occupy a unique space between what we understand and what we continue to explore. There is also a tendency, especially in popular culture, to look for a single defining answer. A hidden method, a lost device, a moment of sudden innovation. But the deeper we look, the more that expectation begins to fade. The pyramids were not built by one idea. They were built by many. Quarrying techniques, transport systems, labor organization, measurement practices, and symbolic motivations all combine to produce the final result. Remove any one of those elements, and the project becomes much harder to sustain. This leads us to a broader reflection about how we interpret the past. When we encounter something impressive, there is often a temptation to explain it in terms that match our expectations of innovation. We look for breakthroughs, for moments of genius, for technologies that resemble our own. But ancient achievements often follow a different pattern. They rely on accumulation rather than disruption, on steady refinement rather than sudden change. The pyramid is a clear example of this. This greatness lies not in a single leap forward, but in the ability to maintain direction over time. And that brings us, quietly, back to the human element. Behind every block, every measurement, every decision, there were individuals contributing in ways both large and small. Some were skilled craftsmen. Others were laborers performing repetitive tasks. Some were administrators keeping records and organizing supplies. Each role mattered. The pyramid did not require every participant to understand the entire project. It required each person to perform their part consistently within a larger system. There is something almost familiar in that structure, not in the scale but in the principle. Large achievements, whether in the ancient world or the modern one, often depend on coordination more than individual brilliance. The pyramid stands as a reminder of that. It is a collective accomplishment, shaped by many hands over many years. And as we look at it now, standing quietly on the Giza Plateau, it is easy to forget the movement that created it. The noise of tools against stone, the sound of sledges being pulled, the coordination of teams working in rhythm, the daily routines that, repeated enough times, gradually transform the landscape. What remains is stillness, but that stillness was earned through motion. So perhaps the final perspective is this. The pyramids were not built in defiance of what was possible. They were built within it. They represent the outer edge of what a well-organized ancient society could achieve, using the knowledge and resources available to it. And in that sense, they are not an anomaly. They are a demonstration. If you imagine standing at Giza during its construction, watching the structure rise slowly against the sky, would it have felt inevitable or extraordinary? Would the process have seemed manageable in small steps, or overwhelming when seen as a whole? And now, looking back from thousands of years later, do you think we are closer to understanding the people who built it, or are we still, in some ways, standing at a distance? As always, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Let me know where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what part of the story stayed with you the most. There is one more dimension to this story that often goes unnoticed, and it has less to do with stone or tools and more to do with time itself. Not just how long the pyramid took to build, but how the ancient Egyptians understood time, continuity, and legacy. Because in many ways, the pyramid is not only a construction project. It is a statement about permanence in a world that was otherwise defined by cycles. The Nile flooded each year, rising and falling in a predictable rhythm. Crops were planted, harvested, and replanted. Life moved in repeating patterns. Against that backdrop, the pyramid stood as something different. It did not rise and fall. It did not renew itself. It endured. And that endurance was not accidental. It was intentional. The pyramid was meant to exist outside the cycle, to remain when everything else changed. This helps us understand why such immense effort was considered worthwhile. The pyramid was not built for immediate use. It was built to extend the presence of the king beyond his lifetime, to anchor his identity in something that would resist decay. In that sense, the pyramid was as much about memory as it was about burial. It was a way of ensuring that the king's name, power, and role in the cosmic order would not simply fade. And yet, there is a quiet irony here. While the pyramid itself has endured, much of what it once contained has not. The outer casing stones have largely disappeared. The burial goods that once filled the internal chambers are gone. The rituals that gave it meaning are no longer practiced. What remains is the structure, stripped of many of its original details, but still commanding attention. It is a reminder that permanence is always partial. Even the most enduring monument cannot preserve everything. This contrast between intention and outcome adds a subtle depth to the story. The builders aimed for eternity, but what survived is a combination of design and chance. The core structure remains because of its mass and stability. Other elements, more vulnerable to time and human intervention, have been lost. In this way, the pyramid teaches us something about history itself. What we see is not the complete past, but what has managed to endure. There is also the question of perception. For modern viewers, the pyramid often appears isolated, standing alone in the desert. But in its original context, it was part of a larger complex. There were temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, and surrounding structures that connected it to ritual practices and daily activity. The pyramid was the centerpiece, but not the whole story. Over time, many of these surrounding elements have been damaged or buried, leaving the central structure more prominent than it once was. This shift in context changes how we interpret the monument. What now feels like a solitary object was once part of a network of spaces and meanings. The pyramid did not stand alone. It was integrated into a landscape of belief and ceremony. Recognizing that helps restore some of the depth that has been lost through time. And then there is the question that often lingers quietly in the background. Could something like this be built today using the same methods? Technically, perhaps yes. With enough labor, time, and organization, the physical process could be recreated. But that answer feels incomplete. Because what made the pyramid possible was not just technique. It was a combination of social structure, belief, and political authority that does not easily translate into the modern world. The ancient Egyptian state could mobilize large numbers of people for a shared purpose in a way that is difficult to replicate today. It could align religious meaning with political power, creating a unified motivation for action. It could sustain a long-term project without the pressures of modern timelines or economic systems. These conditions are as much a part of the pyramid as the stones themselves. So when we ask how the pyramids were built, we are also asking what kind of world made them possible. And that question brings us back to the beginning, to the idea that the answer is not a single technique or secret. It is a system that combined environment, knowledge, labor, and belief into something that could outlast all of them. As we come toward the end of this journey, there is a final perspective worth holding on to. The pyramids are often described as wonders, and in many ways they are. But they are also evidence. Evidence of what human beings can achieve when effort is sustained over time, when knowledge is shared and refined, and when a society commits itself to a long-term vision. And perhaps that is the most grounded way to see them. Not as anomalies, not as mysteries beyond reach, but as the result of choices made, skills developed, and work carried out with consistency and purpose. The wonder does not disappear when we understand them. It changes. It becomes quieter, more reflective, and in some ways more meaningful. If you imagine standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid today, knowing what you know now, does it feel different from the first time you saw it in a photograph or film? Does understanding the process behind it make it more impressive, or does it make it feel more human? And which part of its story stays with you the most, the engineering, the organization, or the belief that gave it shape? As always, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. Let me know where you're watching from, what time it is there, and whether this explanation changed how you think about one of the oldest and most enduring structures in human history. There is one final aspect of the pyramids that becomes clearer only when we look at them not as isolated achievements, but as part of a much longer historical conversation between human ambition and natural limits. Because while the Great Pyramid at Giza represents a peak, it is not the end of the story. It is, in many ways, a moment where several lines of development came together, reached their fullest expression, and then gradually moved in new directions. After Khufu, his successors continued building pyramids, but none matched the same scale or precision. Khufu's pyramid, also at Giza, appears slightly smaller, though its position on higher ground can make it seem more imposing. Menkaur's pyramid is smaller still. This gradual reduction is not accidental. It reflects shifting priorities, changing resources, and perhaps a growing awareness of the limits involved in sustaining such massive projects. The knowledge remained, but the willingness or ability to apply it at that scale seems to have changed. This creates an interesting contrast. The techniques that made the Great Pyramid possible did not disappear. What changed was the context in which those techniques were used. Political stability, economic capacity, and administrative strength all play a role in determining what a society can build. When those conditions shift, so do the outcomes. In that sense, the pyramid is not just a technical achievement. It is also a snapshot of a particular moment when multiple conditions aligned. Over time, Egypt itself experienced periods of central strength and fragmentation. During times of strong centralized authority, large-scale projects became more feasible. During periods of division, resources were spread more thinly, and priorities shifted. The pyramids belong to that earlier phase, when the state could concentrate its efforts in a focused and sustained way. Understanding that helps us see them not as isolated wonders, but as expressions of a broader historical pattern. There is also something quietly revealing in how later cultures responded to the pyramids. They did not attempt to replicate them in the same form. Instead, they admired, adapted, and sometimes misunderstood them. The Romans, for example, built their own pyramids in Egypt and even in Rome itself, but on a much smaller scale and for different purposes. The shape endured, but the system behind it did not transfer in the same way. This again highlights the difference between copying an appearance and reproducing the conditions that made that appearance possible. And so, the pyramids remain somewhat unique, not because their methods were unknowable, but because the combination of factors that produced them was specific to a time and place. They are, in a sense, the result of alignment. Alignment between environment and intention, between knowledge and belief, between labor and leadership. There is also a quieter, more reflective way to think about them. For all their scale and permanence, the pyramids were built by people whose lives were limited in time. Each worker contributed only a small portion of the whole. No single individual, apart from perhaps the king himself in a symbolic sense, could claim ownership of the entire structure. And yet, together, they created something that would outlast all of them. That contrast between individual effort and collective outcome is one of the most enduring themes in history. It appears in many forms across many cultures, but the pyramids make it visible in a particularly clear way. They are not just monuments to a ruler. They are also monuments to coordination, to shared purpose, and to the idea that large achievements are often the result of many small, consistent actions. If we follow that thought a little further, it begins to connect the ancient world to the present in a subtle way. Modern societies build differently with different tools and different goals, but the underlying principle remains. Large systems depend on organization. Progress depends on continuity, and outcomes often depend less on dramatic breakthroughs than on sustained effort over time. The pyramids, then, are not just about the past. They are also a kind of mirror. They reflect back to us questions about what we value, how we organize ourselves, and what we choose to leave behind. Not in stone necessarily, but in the structures we create, whether physical or otherwise. And perhaps that is where the story finds its quiet conclusion. The question we began with, how were the pyramids actually built, leads us through methods, materials, and systems. But it also leads us towards something more reflective. An understanding that the answer is not a single explanation, but a layered one. A combination of environment, knowledge, labor, belief, and time. When all of those elements come together, something remarkable can happen. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. One block at a time. One decision at a time, until eventually what once seemed impossible begins to take shape, and then to endure. And that may be the most lasting impression the pyramids leave behind. Not just that they were built, but that they were built in a way that still makes sense when we look closely enough. The mystery, in the end, is not how they were constructed. It is how often we underestimate what careful planning and human coordination can achieve. As you reflect on this, I'd be interested to know what part of the journey changed your perspective the most. Was it the role of the Nile and transport, the organization of labor, the evolving ramp theories, or the deeper connection between belief and construction? And if you imagine explaining the pyramids to someone seeing them for the first time, what would you emphasize? As always, thank you for spending this time here. Let me know where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if we allow the story to settle just a little further, there is still one quiet thread left to follow. Something that sits beneath all the engineering, all the organization, and even beneath the belief systems we've explored. It is the question of how knowledge itself moved through this world, and how something as complex as pyramid construction could be preserved, refined, and applied across generations without the kinds of written technical manuals we rely on today. Because while ancient Egypt did have writing, much of the practical knowledge involved in building was likely transmitted through experience. Master builders, overseers, and skilled craftsmen would have learned through apprenticeship, observation, and repetition. Techniques were not simply recorded. They were practiced, corrected, and improved in real time. This creates a different image of knowledge. Not something static, but something living, carried by people rather than documents. And that helps explain something subtle but important. The pyramids were not just built once. They were built many times in different forms across different reigns. Each project would have reinforced existing knowledge while also introducing small adjustments. Over time, this created a kind of cumulative expertise. Not a single breakthrough, but a tradition of building that became more confident with each attempt. This also means that when we look at the Great Pyramid, we are not just seeing the work of one generation. We are seeing the result of accumulated understanding. The lessons of earlier pyramids, including their flaws, were not lost. They were incorporated. The change in angle in the bent pyramid, for example, may have been a response to structural concerns. That experience likely informed later designs, contributing to the stability of Khufu's pyramid. In this way, even what might appear as failure becomes part of the success. There is something quietly reassuring in that pattern. It reminds us that progress often depends on the willingness to adapt. The pyramid did not emerge from perfection. It emerged from adjustment. And yet, despite this continuity, there is also a sense of fragility. Because once the conditions that supported this tradition began to change, the knowledge itself became harder to sustain. As political structures shifted and priorities evolved, the large-scale pyramid projects diminished. The skills did not vanish overnight, but they were no longer applied in the same way at the same scale. Over time, the tradition lost its central place. This raises an interesting point about historical memory. When a society stops practicing a particular skill, even if the results of that skill remain visible, the process behind it can become less clear. Later observers may see the pyramid, but not fully understand how it was made. This gap between result and method is where speculation often begins. And it is part of why the pyramids have attracted so many imaginative explanations over the centuries. But if we return to the evidence, the quieter explanation remains the most consistent. The pyramids were built through methods that were understood at the time, refined through experience, and supported by a system capable of sustaining them. There is no need to separate the builders from their work by assuming knowledge beyond their reach. In fact, doing so can distance us from the real achievement, which lies in what they were able to accomplish with the tools and understanding they had. There is also a deeper human connection here. When we recognize that the pyramids were built through learned skill and shared knowledge, they become less distant. They are no longer the product of an unknowable past. They are the result of processes that, in different forms, still exist today. Teaching, learning, practicing, improving. These are not ancient ideas. They are ongoing ones. And perhaps that is part of why the pyramids continue to hold attention. They exist at the intersection of distance and familiarity. Distant in time, in culture, in context, but familiar in the underlying patterns of effort and organization. They feel both remote and recognizable at the same time. As the centuries passed, the pyramids took on new meanings. For some, they became symbols of mystery. For others, symbols of endurance. For historians and archaeologists, they became subjects of careful study. Each perspective adds something, but none fully replaces the original context. That context belongs to a world that is no longer present, a world in which the pyramid was not an ancient wonder, but a contemporary project shaped by immediate concerns and lived experience. If we try, just briefly, to return to that original perspective, the pyramid becomes something different again. Not an object of distant admiration, but a work in progress. Dust in the air, voices coordinating effort, tools striking stone, plans being adjusted, food being prepared for workers, boats arriving with supplies, a constant movement of activity, all directed toward a single goal. And then, slowly, that movement comes to an end. The structure stands complete. The activity fades. What remains is the result. It is a simple sequence, but one that is easy to overlook when we only see the final form. The pyramid invites us to remember the process behind the product, the effort behind the outcome. And that may be the quiet lesson that stays with us. That even the most enduring structures begin with ordinary actions, repeated with care. That complexity can grow from simplicity when it is guided by purpose. And that history, when we look closely enough, often becomes less about mystery and more about understanding. So as we leave this subject, there is one final thought to consider. When future generations look back at our own time, at the structures and systems we have created, what will seem obvious to them, and what will seem difficult to explain? Will they see our achievements as natural outcomes of our conditions, or will they search for hidden explanations where none are needed? And perhaps, just as we have done with the pyramids, they will come to realize that the most convincing answers are often the most grounded ones, built not on mystery, but on the steady, patient work of people doing what they understand, as well as they can over time. If you've been listening quietly through all of this, I'd be curious what stayed with you the most. Was it the idea of the pyramid as a system, the role of belief in shaping construction, or the way knowledge was passed from one generation to the next? And as always, feel free to share where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what story you'd like us to explore together next. And as the story settles into its final moments, there is one last perspective that often feels the most understated, yet perhaps the most meaningful. It is not about how the pyramids were built or even why, but about what happens after we understand them more clearly. Because something interesting occurs when a mystery becomes less mysterious. It does not necessarily become less fascinating. In many cases, it becomes more grounded, more relatable, and in a quiet way, more impressive. The pyramids are a good example of this. When we move away from the idea of hidden secrets or lost technologies, what remains is something deeply human. A long-term project carried out with patience, coordination, and belief. And there is a certain calm in that realization. For centuries, the pyramids have invited speculation. People have looked at them and wondered if there must be something missing from the explanation, something extraordinary that we have not yet discovered. But what if the real story is not hidden at all? What if it is simply distributed across many small, understandable parts, each one contributing to a larger whole? That idea can feel almost counterintuitive at first. We are often drawn to dramatic answers, to single breakthroughs that explain everything at once. But the pyramids suggest a different pattern. They suggest that consistency can be more powerful than sudden innovation, that systems can achieve what individuals alone cannot, and that time, when used deliberately, becomes a tool in its own right. There is also something worth noticing about how the pyramids affect us today. Even with all the knowledge we now have, people still stand in front of them and feel a sense of scale that is difficult to put into words. That reaction is not based on mystery alone. It is based on presence. The physical reality of the structure, the weight of it, the way it interacts with light and space, all of that contributes to an experience that remains powerful. And perhaps that is where understanding and wonder begin to meet. The pyramids do not need to remain unexplained in order to be meaningful. In fact, understanding them more fully allows us to appreciate a different kind of achievement. Not one based on impossibility, but one based on discipline and continuity. A structure that reflects not just what was built, but how it was built and why it was sustained over time. If we follow that thought a little further, it begins to connect the ancient world to something more familiar. The idea that large outcomes are often the result of many small, consistent actions is not limited to history. It appears in many areas of life, across different periods and cultures. The pyramid simply makes that pattern visible in a way that is difficult to ignore. And yet, there is still room for reflection. When we look at the pyramids now, we are seeing the end of a process, but not the full experience of it. We are seeing what remained, not everything that once surrounded it. The workers are gone. The sounds are gone. The routines, the daily efforts, the moments of difficulty and adjustment, all of that exists only in fragments. What remains is the result, and from that result we try to reconstruct the process. That act of reconstruction is, in itself, a reminder of how history works. We do not have complete access to the past. We have evidence, patterns, and interpretations. And from those we build an understanding that is always open to refinement. The story of the pyramids has changed over time, not because the pyramids changed, but because our ability to interpret them has improved. In that sense, the pyramids are not only objects of history, they are also part of an ongoing conversation. Each generation asks the same question in slightly different ways. How was this done? What does it mean? What does it tell us about the people who built it? And each time, the answer becomes a little more detailed, a little more grounded, and perhaps a little more human. There is also a quiet balance in how we hold this knowledge. On one hand, we understand more than ever before. On the other hand, there are still details that remain uncertain. The exact configuration of ramps at higher levels, the precise organization of certain tasks, these are still areas of discussion. But that uncertainty does not weaken the explanation. It simply reminds us that history is not a finished subject. It is something we continue to explore, and that ongoing exploration is part of what keeps the pyramids relevant. They are not just relics of a distant past. They are active subjects of study, continuing to reveal new insights as methods improve and new discoveries are made. So as we bring this journey to a close, there is one final way to look at the pyramids, one that feels both simple and complete. They were built by people who understood their world well enough to shape it in a lasting way. People who could organize effort across time, who could refine techniques through experience, and who could connect physical work to larger meaning. The result of that combination is what still stands today. Not a mystery beyond reach, but an achievement within context. And perhaps that is the most lasting takeaway, that the past, when we look closely enough, often becomes less distant. Not because it becomes identical to the present, but because we begin to recognize familiar patterns within it. effort, organization, belief, time. These are not ancient ideas. They are enduring ones. If you've been listening all the way through, I'd be interested to know what changed most for you. Did the pyramids feel different once we moved past the usual myths? Did the explanation feel more convincing, or perhaps more surprising in its simplicity? And if you were to describe this story to someone else, what part would you emphasize? As always, feel free to share where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what piece of history you'd like to explore next. And even now, after we have traced the materials, the methods, the labor, and the belief behind the pyramids, there is still a final layer that tends to linger quietly in the background. It is the difference between knowing something and truly absorbing it. Because understanding how the pyramids were built does not immediately change how they feel. You can know about sledges moving across dampened sand, about carefully measured angles, about teams working in coordinated rhythms, and still find yourself standing in front of the structure with a sense that it exceeds explanation. That reaction is not a failure of understanding. It is a reflection of scale, of time, and of the gap between intellectual knowledge and physical experience. And that gap is important. The Great Pyramid, even in its current state, still carries a presence that is difficult to reduce to process alone. It rises in a way that feels both deliberate and inevitable, as if it belongs to the landscape while also standing apart from it. That duality is part of what gives it its lasting impact. It is both the result of human action and something that feels almost beyond it. But when we return to the story we have followed, something shifts. The pyramid becomes less distant, not smaller, not less impressive, but more connected to the people who built it. The stone blocks are no longer abstract. They are the result of quarry cuts, of measured effort, of repeated motion. The smooth lines are no longer just geometry. They are the outcome of careful alignment and correction over time. And slowly, almost without noticing, the monument begins to feel less like a question and more like an answer. An answer to what a society can do when it aligns its resources, its beliefs, and its time toward a single purpose. There is also something worth noticing about how this understanding changes our relationship to the past. When we rely on mystery alone, the past can feel unreachable, almost separate from us. But when we recognize the processes behind achievements like the pyramids, the distance begins to narrow. The people of ancient Egypt are no longer defined only by what they built, but by how they built it. They become planners, organizers, workers, observers of nature, and participants in a shared system. And in that sense, they become more recognizable. This does not make their world identical to ours. Their beliefs, their structures of authority, and their daily lives were very different. But the underlying patterns, the need to solve problems, to coordinate effort, to pass knowledge from one person to another, those patterns remain familiar. And that familiarity is what allows history to feel meaningful rather than distant. There is also a quiet lesson in how long it has taken us to reach this understanding. For centuries, the pyramids stood without clear explanation, inviting speculation and interpretation. Over time, through careful study, excavation, and analysis, a more grounded picture began to emerge. That process mirrors the very thing we have been describing. Just as the pyramids were built through accumulation, our understanding of them has also been built step by step. Each discovery added to the last. Each theory tested, refined, or replaced. The final picture is not the result of a single insight, but of sustained inquiry. And that, in itself, is a kind of parallel. The builders of the pyramids worked through repetition and refinement. The historians and archaeologists who study them have done the same. Both processes depend on patience. As we reach the end of this documentary, there is one final contrast to hold on to. The pyramid appears still unchanged, almost outside of time. But everything about its existence is tied to time. The years it took to build, the generations that passed knowledge forward, the centuries that reshaped its surroundings, the long stretch of history that transformed it from a royal tomb into a global symbol. It is, in a quiet way, a structure made of time as much as stone. And perhaps that is why it continues to draw attention. Not because it hides a secret, but because it reveals a pattern. A pattern in which human beings, working within the limits of their world, are able to create something that extends beyond those limits. Not through sudden leaps, but through steady effort. Not through mystery, but through understanding. If you imagine the final moment of construction, when the last stone was placed and the work came to an end, it was likely not a dramatic scene. There was no single instant where everything changed. Instead, the activity would have slowed. The tasks would have been completed one by one. And eventually, there would have been nothing left to add. The pyramid would have stood not as a sudden creation, but as the result of everything that came before. And then life would have continued around it. That quiet ending is easy to overlook, but it carries its own kind of meaning. It reminds us that even the largest achievements are part of a larger flow. They begin, they take shape, and then they settle into the world, becoming part of the landscape of memory. So as we leave this story behind, perhaps the most useful way to think about the pyramids is not as isolated wonders, but as expressions of continuity. Continuity of knowledge, continuity of effort, continuity of belief. And when those elements come together, something lasting can emerge. If you've been listening through this entire journey, I'd be interested to know what stayed with you most in the end. Was it the practical methods behind the construction, the organization that made it possible, or the way our understanding of the pyramids has evolved over time? And as always, feel free to share where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what piece of history you'd like to explore next. And perhaps, as we come to the very end of this exploration, there is one final way to hold the pyramids in mind, one that brings together everything we've discussed, but in a quieter, more reflective way. If you strip away the myths, the exaggerations, and even the technical details for a moment, what remains is something surprisingly simple. A group of people over many years working together with a shared understanding of purpose. That idea may sound modest compared to the scale of the pyramid itself, but it is, in many ways, the most accurate foundation of the story. Because without that shared purpose, none of the engineering solutions, none of the labor systems, and none of the symbolic meaning would have been enough on their own. The pyramid required alignment. Alignment between leadership and labor, between belief and action, between planning and execution, and perhaps most importantly, alignment across time, where each day's work contributed to something that would not be finished for many years. That kind of alignment is not easy to achieve, even in the modern world. It requires consistency, structure, and a level of coordination that extends beyond individual effort. And yet, in ancient Egypt, under the right conditions, it was achieved. This brings us to a subtle but important shift in perspective. When we first ask how the pyramids were built, it often feels like a technical question. We imagine tools, ramps, and physical strength. But by the time we reach the end of the answer, the question has changed. It becomes a question about systems, about how a society organizes itself, about how knowledge is shared, about how effort is sustained over time, and about how belief can give direction to physical work. The pyramid, in that sense, is not just an object. It is a reflection of a system functioning at a very high level of coherence. And that coherence is what allowed something so large, so demanding, and so long-term to actually be completed. There is also something quietly humbling in that realization, because it suggests that the limits we often imagine, what is possible, what is practical, are not always fixed. They depend on how well a system is able to coordinate its parts. The ancient Egyptians did not have modern machinery, but they had something equally powerful in its own way. They had continuity of labor, where workers returned to the same tasks day after day. Continuity of knowledge, where techniques were passed down and refined. Continuity of purpose, where the goal remained clear across years, even decades. And when those forms of continuity come together, they create a kind of momentum, a slow, steady progression that, over time, produces results that can seem almost impossible when viewed all at once. But from within the process, they are simply the outcome of persistence. That idea, more than any specific method or theory, may be the most enduring lesson of the pyramids. Not that they were built through a single brilliant idea, but that they were built through many consistent actions aligned over time. And that perspective changes how we see them. They are no longer distant anomalies, standing apart from human experience. They become part of a broader pattern, one that appears in different forms throughout history, whenever people organize themselves toward a shared goal. There is also a quiet contrast worth noticing here. The pyramid feels permanent, almost unchanging. But everything that created it was temporary. The workers, the tools, the daily routines, all of it existed only for a moment in time. And yet, through that temporary effort, something lasting was created. That contrast between the temporary and the permanent is part of what gives the pyramid its emotional weight. It reminds us that enduring structures are often built from fleeting actions, that what remains is not always a reflection of permanence in the moment, but of consistency over time. And perhaps that is why the pyramids continue to resonate. Not because they are beyond explanation, but because they reflect something fundamental about how human achievement works. They show us that scale does not always come from complexity, that endurance does not always come from strength alone, and that meaning can emerge when effort is sustained long enough to take shape. As you sit with that thought, there is one final question that might be worth considering. If you had been part of that world, standing on the Giza plateau, watching the pyramid rise slowly over the years, Would it have felt extraordinary while it was happening, or only in hindsight? Would the daily work have felt routine, or would there have been a sense, even then, that something lasting was being created? And now, looking back from thousands of years later, do we see the pyramid more clearly because of what we know, or because of what we've taken the time to understand? If you've made it all the way to the end of this documentary, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? And which part of this story stayed with you the most? And as always, if there's another piece of history you'd like to explore in this calm, thoughtful way, feel free to share that too. And as the final moments of this story begin to settle, there is one last quiet perspective worth holding on to, something that sits gently at the intersection of everything we've explored. Because after all the questions about ramps, labor, tools, and organization, the pyramids leave us with something that feels less like a technical answer and more like a way of seeing. A way of seeing how human effort becomes visible across time. When the Great Pyramid was first completed, it was not ancient. It was new. Its edges were sharp, its casing stones bright, its presence unmistakably part of the living world around it. People would have seen it not as a mystery, but as a result. A finished project, emerging from years of familiar work. That contrast is easy to forget. To us, the pyramid belongs to the distant past. To them, it belonged to the present. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Because it reminds us that what feels distant and extraordinary now was once immediate and practical. The workers who hauled the stones did not see themselves as part of a future wonder. They were responding to the demands of their time, their roles, and their society. And yet, through that ordinary participation, they contributed to something that would outlast all of it. There is something quietly profound in that. It suggests that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary is not always as clear as it seems. That what appears monumental in hindsight may have been built through actions that felt routine in the moment. And that realization brings us closer to the people behind the structure. It allows us to imagine the small details that rarely survive in the historical record. The conversations between workers, the adjustments made during construction, the moments of difficulty and the moments of progress. None of these are preserved in full, but they are implied by the scale of the achievement. The pyramid, in that sense, is both a presence and an absence. It shows us what was created, but it also hints at everything that was required to create it. And that duality is part of what makes it so enduring. Even now, standing at a distance, we are able to reconstruct parts of the process. We can identify quarry sites, transport routes, tool marks, and construction patterns. Each piece adds to the picture, making it clearer, more grounded, more complete. But there is always a limit. Not everything can be known. And perhaps that is where the pyramids find their lasting balance. They are understood enough to be appreciated for what they are, but not so completely explained that they lose their sense of depth. There is still room for careful inquiry, for thoughtful discussion, for the kind of curiosity that does not rely on mystery, but on attention. That kind of curiosity is quieter, but it is also more enduring. It does not depend on surprise. It depends on understanding. And as we bring this to a close, there is one final connection to consider. The pyramids were built through a relationship with the natural world. The Nile provided transport, the desert provided stone, the sky provided orientation. The builders worked with these elements, not against them. They observed patterns, adapted to conditions, and used what was available to them in deliberate ways. That relationship with environment is easy to overlook, but it is central to the story. The pyramid is not just placed in the landscape, it is shaped by it. And that idea feels particularly relevant when we think about how human achievements are always tied to their surroundings. No structure exists in isolation. It emerges from a context, and it carries that context within it, even if it is not immediately visible. So when we look at the pyramids now, we are not just looking at stone arranged in a particular form. We are looking at a moment in history where environment, knowledge, belief, and organization came together in a way that allowed something lasting to take shape. That moment has passed, but its result remains. And perhaps that is the most complete way to understand it. Not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a process that has already unfolded, leaving behind something we can still learn from if we take the time to look closely. If you've followed this entire journey, from the first question to this final reflection, you've already done something similar. You've taken the time to move beyond the surface, to look at the structure not just as it appears, but as it was created. And that kind of attention is what makes history feel meaningful. So before we leave this subject behind, I'd like to ask you one last quiet question. Now that you understand more about how the pyramids were built, do they feel more distant or more connected to you? And if you were to stand there in person, knowing what you know now, do you think you would see the pyramid as a monument, a process, or something that sits somewhere in between? As always, feel free to share your thoughts, along with where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And until then, thank you for spending this time here and for taking the story one careful step further. And if we allow ourselves one final moment of stillness with this subject, there is a gentle realization that begins to form, one that is less about the pyramids themselves and more about how we choose to understand them. Because in the end, the question was never just how they were built. It was also how we approach the past. Do we look for answers that feel dramatic and immediate, or do we allow space for explanations that are slower, layered, and built from many small parts? The pyramids quietly encourage the second approach. They ask us to slow down, to observe carefully, and to accept that some of the most remarkable achievements in history are the result of patience rather than sudden discovery. And there is something fitting about that. A structure built over decades through steady effort is best understood in the same way, through steady attention. If we imagine the Giza Plateau at the height of construction one last time, not as a finished monument, but as a place of ongoing activity, the scene becomes almost rhythmic. Teams moving in coordination, stones arriving in sequence, measurements being checked and rechecked, food being prepared, instructions being given and followed. A constant flow of motion, not chaotic, but organized. And within that motion, something larger was taking shape. Not all at once, but gradually. That gradual emergence is easy to overlook when we only see the final result. But it is, in many ways, the most important part of the story, because it reminds us that even the most imposing structures begin in ways that are almost unremarkable. One action repeated, then another, and then another, until eventually the accumulation becomes visible. There is a quiet lesson in that pattern, one that extends beyond the pyramids themselves. It suggests that scale is often a matter of time and consistency, rather than complexity alone. That what seems overwhelming at a distance can be approached step by step when seen from within the process. The ancient builders did not need to solve the entire problem at once. They needed to solve the next task and then the next. And over years of effort, those solutions combined into something that could not have been achieved in a single moment. That perspective brings us closer to the experience of the people who were actually there. For them, the pyramid was not a finished object. It was a daily reality, a place of work, of routine, of responsibility. The scale of the project may have been visible, but the work itself was immediate. Tasks to complete, stones to move, measurements to confirm. And yet, even within that routine, there may have been moments of awareness. Moments where the structure rising around them hinted at something beyond the present. Something that would remain after the work was done. We cannot know exactly how they felt, but we can recognize the possibility that even within ordinary effort, there can be a sense of participating in something lasting. That idea feels particularly resonant when we consider how the pyramid exists now. Not as a project, but as a presence. It no longer changes. It no longer grows. It simply remains. And in that stillness, it carries the imprint of everything that led to its creation. Every decision, every adjustment, every repeated action, all of it is contained within the structure, even if it is no longer visible. That is what gives the pyramid its depth. It is not just what we see, but what is embedded within it. And perhaps that is why it continues to hold attention, even after thousands of years. Not because it defies explanation, but because it invites reflection. It encourages us to think not only about the past, but about the processes that shape outcomes, about the relationship between effort and result, about how time can transform repeated action into something enduring. These are not ideas limited to ancient Egypt. They are patterns that appear again and again in different forms across different periods. The pyramid simply makes them visible in a way that is difficult to ignore. So as we come to a quiet close, there is one final way to carry this story forward. Not as a collection of facts about construction methods, but as an example of how understanding deepens when we look beyond the surface. The pyramids were not built through mystery. They were built through clarity. Clarity of purpose, clarity of process, clarity of organization. And when those forms of clarity are sustained over time, they have the power to shape something that lasts far beyond the moment in which it was created. If you've been here from the beginning, listening through each layer of the story, then you've already followed that same path. Moving from question to explanation, from surface to depth, from curiosity to understanding. And that journey, in its own quiet way, mirrors the subject itself, step by step, layer by layer, until the full shape begins to appear. So before we leave, I'd like to ask you one final thought to carry with you. Now that the pyramids feel less like a mystery and more like a process, do they seem more extraordinary or more understandable? And which of those perspectives do you find more meaningful? As always, feel free to share your thoughts, along with where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what piece of history you'd like to explore next. And until our next story, thank you for taking the time to see history not just as it appears, but as it was carefully, patiently built. And perhaps, after everything we've explored, there is one final way to sit with this story, one that feels less like an ending and more like a quiet pause. Because the pyramids do not really conclude. They remain. Long after the questions have been asked, long after the explanations have been refined, they continue to stand in the same place, under the same sky, carrying with them the weight of everything we've tried to understand. And in that stillness, they invite a different kind of reflection. Not about how they were built or even why, but about what it means for something to last. In most parts of human life, things are temporary. Buildings change. Cities grow and fade. Systems rise and fall. Even the most carefully planned structures are eventually replaced, repurposed, or forgotten. But the pyramids resist that pattern. They have endured through changes in language, culture, technology, and belief. Empires have come and gone around them. Interpretations have shifted. Meanings have evolved. And yet, the structure itself remains largely unchanged. That endurance is not just a feature of their construction. It is part of their identity. And it raises a quiet question. What allows something to last in a world that is constantly changing? We've already seen part of the answer. Stability of design, strength of material, care in construction. But there is also something less tangible involved. Relevance. The pyramids have continued to matter, not only because they exist, but because people have continued to look at them, to study them, to wonder about them. Each generation has found its own reason to return to them. For ancient Egyptians, they were part of a living belief system. For later travelers, they were objects of curiosity. For modern observers, they are subjects of study and reflection. And through all of that, the pyramids have remained part of the conversation. That ongoing attention is part of what keeps them present. Because history is not only about what survives physically. It is also about what continues to be remembered, revisited, and reinterpreted. In that sense, the pyramids exist in two ways at once. They exist as physical structures, anchored in stone. And they exist as ideas carried forward through time. Those two forms of existence support each other. The structure invites attention. The attention preserves the meaning. And together, they create a kind of continuity that extends far beyond the original moment of construction. There is something quietly powerful in that relationship. It suggests that what we build does not stand alone. It becomes part of a longer chain of perception, shaped not only by its creators, but by everyone who encounters it afterward. The pyramid was built with a specific purpose, but its meaning has expanded over time. And that expansion is still ongoing. Even now, as you listen to this, you are part of that process, adding your own understanding, your own interpretation, your own sense of what it represents. And that brings us gently to one last perspective. The pyramids are often described as monuments to the past, but they are also, in a quieter way, part of the present. Not because they change, but because our relationship to them does. Each time we revisit them, we see something slightly different. A new detail, a new connection, a new way of understanding the same structure. And that ongoing process of seeing is what keeps them alive in a historical sense. So as we let this story come to rest, there is no need for a dramatic conclusion. The pyramid does not require one. It simply stands, a reminder of what was built, a reflection of how it was built, and an invitation to continue thinking about it long after the explanation is complete. If you've been here from the very beginning, moving through each layer of this story, then you've already taken part in that process. You've followed the question from curiosity to understanding, from mystery to method, from surface to depth. And perhaps in doing so, the pyramid now feels a little different. Not just something to look at, but something to think with, something that carries meaning not because it hides a secret, but because it reveals a pattern of effort, organization, belief, and time. And as you step away from this story, there is one final thought to carry with you. When you encounter something that feels too large, too complex, or too distant to understand, it may not require a single answer. It may require patience, the same kind of patience that built the pyramid, the same kind of patience that allowed us to understand it. And perhaps, in that sense, the pyramids are not just a subject of history. They are also a quiet guide to how we approach it. As always, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And after everything we've explored together, what is the one idea about the pyramids that stayed with you the most? And if there's another story you'd like to take this kind of slow, careful journey through, feel free to share that as well. Until then, thank you for spending this time here and for letting the story unfold at its own pace.